But please note that we will be taking a short break due to the US election. And so our next episode after this one will be on Wednesday, November 18th, in 3 weeks. If you'd like to discuss today's episode in real time or submit questions for Q&A, please join us in the TTW Discord. You can find the Discord back channel by following the link in the description of this YouTube video and on our website, theorizingtheweb.org. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the production team at the Museum of the Moving Image, without whom Theorizing the Web Presents truly would not be possible. I'd also like to thank my fellow organizing committee members, as well as all 3 of today's panelists. And on behalf of all of us, we'd like to thank you for watching and participating. If you liked today's talk and would like to see more, please consider making a donation to both Museum of the Moving Image and Theorizing the Web. Every donation helps us to produce content like this, and we're grateful that we can do that with you. And with that, I will turn it over to today's moderator, Dr. David A. Banks. David is a visiting assistant professor of geography and planning at the University of Albany, SUNY. He is also an editor-at-large for Real Life magazine, co-chair of Theorizing the Web, and a host of the Ironweeds podcast. He is currently writing a book about how cities act like reality TV stars. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Whitney. I'm joined by 2 really excellent scholars today, and we are first going to hear from Jenny Zhang. Jenny Zhang is a software developer and writer interested in tech policy, digital rights, the attention economy, media studies, and social justice. When she's not working as a staff engineer at Mozilla, she reads speculative fiction and drinks too much coffee and doom scrolls. Highly relatable. Jenny, why don't you join us here and we'll get started. And then later we're going to hear also from Leo Shaw. So please stay tuned there.
Jenny, I think you're muted. Do you want to unmute and start over?
Looks like we might be having 1 or 2 audio problems with Jenny's mic. We're gonna deal with that right now, and why don't we hear from Leo while that gets resolved. Leo is a strategist and editorial worker interested in the politics of urbanism. He works at the architecture and design studio Snøhetta and is part of the team at Arena, a member-supported platform for connecting ideas. Leo, are you there?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. Let's take it away, Leo.
Okay, let's get the screen share up here. Okay, are we all good on audio and video? Okay,
yes.
Great. Thanks, David, and thank you again to Theorizing the Web for having me. My name's Leo. I'm an editorial worker and strategist in architecture. And today I want to talk a little bit about selfie playgrounds, so-called, and other pop-up experiences as a way of understanding how spatial practices and the digital platform economy are converging to shape the built environment. These are 4 different examples of what is often called so-called experiential or immersive design. And these examples are not only designed for sensory impact, but also to be captured and shared on social media. And even though spectacles like Meow Wolf or the Kusama exhibition that you can see here tend to be the most famous examples, they've slowly proliferated into many different industries and institutions. And I'm interested not only in how these so-called experiential spaces became such a normalized part of urban life, but also how they reflect a broader set of systems and politics transforming the city. So you've probably seen a headline like this before, which I think illustrates a couple of different things. First, this isn't a brand new trend, but a gradual transformation in the way that urban space is produced, designed, and used. So you can see here that this article is from 2017, and at that point, the authors were already talking about something called the grammable city. And second, if this shift is something that's happening to the city at a structural level, I think it needs to be understood in those terms. In other words, this isn't just a question of architecture or tech and isolation, but has more to do with a certain set of operations linking the design of the built environment to the mechanics of digital platforms. And over the last several years, we've seen these strategies used across a wide variety of spaces. So you have your rosé mansions and your museums of ice cream. Those may be the most transactional or performative, but we've also seen stores turn into containers for different kinds of so-called experiences. This is a meditation class at a Lululemon. At the same time, museums have started to curate more experiential exhibitions. This is the new museum. And public spaces can even become this kind of experience when they aren't explicitly designed. So this is a block in Dumbo that's kind of turned into a pilgrimage spot for selfie takers. So what makes a space, quote unquote, experiential? I'm using this term a lot, and it's something that comes out of marketing, and it basically refers to an event or a space that brings people into contact with a brand or a company. So a pop-up shop or a sponsored concert or like a Nike running club, all of those are experiential strategies. And even though it's one of these kind of horrible marketing terms, I sort of like it because it's accidentally revealing. At first, it sounds redundant. If you're physically in a space, how can you not be experiencing it? But I think experiential is one of those terms kind of like IRL, where the redundancy actually implies this whole other world of online sociality that's actually taking place within and all around physical space. So you're having an experience, but you're also broadcasting it into this other space made out of posts, feeds, and audience networks. And for an example of how this works, I kind of want to go all the way back to 2012 to one of the first experiential spaces. This is the Rain Room. And this opened at the Barbican Art Gallery in London first before traveling around the world. So in the Rain Room, you would enter this darkened space that you can see here with water falling continuously, but because of sensors that captured your movement, you could walk around and never actually get wet. So you had this magical experience of seeing the rain falling all around you. And this was one of the first exhibitions like this to go massively viral, in part because it was preemptively art directed to photograph really well for the web. So it was really easy to get the kind of amazing silhouette you can see here because of the lighting and the layout of the space. And once it blew up online, the Rain Room, it traveled first to Los Angeles and then to MoMA in New York, where people waited for hours in line just to be able to take this exact same image. And when it came out, or when it opened, the curator made this statement, which I think was really prescient. She said, "The installation encourages people to become performers on an unexpected stage." And I think this really captures not only what people were trying to get out of the exhibition, but actually the wider media ecosystem in which it became such a phenomenon. It's worth remembering that the installation went up right as Instagram basically was taking off. So Facebook bought the platform here in April of 2012, and it was installed in October. And in between those dates, the user base more than doubled as the platform kind of started on this growth path that you can see on the right. And I point this out because it's a good example of the ways that cultures of design and cultures of technology interlock in these mutually productive but non-deterministic ways. So Instagram needed sites like the Rain Room, which could transform the experience of space into engaging content. And the designers of the Rain Room took advantage of Instagram's algorithm and affordances to create this viral network. So to dig a little deeper here, I think there are three overlapping aspects of an experiential space. And here I'm sort of tweaking a few categories described by the geographers Shenya van der Graaf and Peter Bellon. So the first is the process in which these spaces are intended to be turned into media. The rain room is designed to be repackaged as a separate media artifact, which is then distributed and consumed by digital audiences. It only really takes on this full meaning in that broader context. And the second has to do with the creation and maintenance of individual identity. So this is something that the sociologist Jenny Davis has written about. She describes social media profiles as structures which allow people to activate different categories of identity through performance. And as people invoke certain versions of themselves, she notes that, quote, documentation is a shared expectation among social media users, compelling individuals to record and share as an integral part of the identity process, end quote. So I would add that these spaces offer kind of a complementary physical stage that cues up this process. For example, the rain room attracts people who want to broadcast an image of themselves as the kind of person who would seek out that transformative art experience. And finally, these spaces emerge in response to the broader mechanics of the platform economy. So they only really occur in a world where people are navigating the city through a whole stack of platforms, from Google Maps to Instagram, which exert pressures and offer incentives for different ways of organizing space and behavior. So if these are the ingredients of the experiential placemaking formula, how do we go from something discrete like the rain room to something like Hudson Yards, which represents experiential transformation at the urban scale? In other words, how do these strategies become embedded in the underlying systems of planning, finance, design, and policy, which actually produce the built environment? So in order to answer that question, I think we need to look at a kind of transformation happening in the way we understand platform capitalism, which basically refers to a business model that mediates between different sides of a market in order to extract data and create value. And over the past few years, geographers have started to think critically about how platform capitalism interacts with urban processes and infrastructures, leading to this newer concept of platform urbanism. And just to summarize it kind of bluntly, I would say that this is kind of the field of interactions between digital technologies on one hand, finance and capital on another, and the production of space. So the geographer John Stalin writes that urban platforms act as infrastructures for the extraction of place-based value accessible only through that platform. So if you think about the way that like Seamless or Airbnb works, this is basically what they're doing, right? And I think another helpful thing to kind of recognize here is that it doesn't really require like a smart city or an Elon Musk style techno-futurism. This is more about how financial and spatial and technological strategies can reshape existing urban spaces in contingent ways. So one of the best places to watch this playing out is actually in Soho, which is one of the main shopping districts in Manhattan. Before COVID-19, commercial rents in Soho were so high that even luxury retailers couldn't hold a lease. So over the past several years, much of this area has transformed into an experiment in replacing traditional stores with temporary marketing activations. And this is happening against the backdrop of what is called high rent blight. So that refers to the fact that property values have risen so high that landlords will essentially refuse to rent to anyone that isn't like a bank or a Starbucks or an international chain. Instead of renewing commercial leases, which can last like between 10 and 20 years, they'll just allow their storefronts to sit vacant until a corporate tenant comes along who can pay maybe double or quadruple the rent. So this map is a visualization, and you can see the density here in Soho of some of those spaces. So in Soho, many stores and companies which still maintain a retail presence have remodeled so that physical spaces perform some of the same viral marketing functions as a rain room or something else. So on the left, this is called the Clubhouse at Dolce & Gabbana, and I have to say I haven't been here, but it looks a lot like one of these kind of Instagram museums that we're talking about. And on the left, this is a sort of more community-oriented model. This is like a high-end cycling brand, and what they do is they charge a membership to people to be able to show up to the store and get coffee and attend these kind of exclusive events, a little bit more similar to the Lululemon example. And then you have spaces which are not really aimed at sales at all, but use increasingly ambitious experience design to introduce customers to brands and products. So on the left, I think this was in 2016, this is like a whole restaurant that Google created, where all the waiters and chefs spoke different languages, and then you used Google Translate to understand. On the right, this is a space by Casper where you can basically book a nap pod. It's right on like Houston and Broadway, I think. I'm not sure why you'd take a nap there, but that's what that was. So what these experiential spaces offer is a new way to keep storefronts filled and money coming into landlords without the contractual obligations of signing a real lease. So it's essentially kind of like an Airbnb style alternative to commercial tenancy. And several online platforms have jumped in to advertise and broker these arrangements. So you can see that in the interface here. These are people who are listing spaces that brands or companies or retailers might be able to rent as a pop-up. And in this light, an experiential activation not only refers to a customer's experience with a brand, but also to the mobilization of an otherwise dormant financial and physical asset, the space. And what it does is it basically extends the extractive capacity of both the property owner and this new platform. One interesting development is that a kind of discount price version of this strategy is also underway nearby as a means of gentrifying Chinatown. So this is Canal Street, which is home to dozens of longstanding immigrant-owned businesses, but is also an area where speculators have scooped up several commercial properties over the years and basically allowed them to sit vacant. So that's what you're seeing up here on the left. And as nearby development heats up, these owners are basically taking a platform-enabled approach to reopening those places. So there's one company called United American Land, and they own about 20 vacant Canal Street properties. You can see the kind of map there on the left. And what they've done is they've hired a creative agency called Wallplay to rebrand the neighborhood by curating a rotation of pop-ups, which include fashion shows, sample sales, VR exhibitions, etc. And you can see those here on the right. And what the owner is hoping to get out of these is basically a boost in the value of the properties so that they can eventually knock these things down and then redevelop them completely into more upmarket retail and maybe condos. And here's some marketing copy that Wallplay uses to rent out the spaces. So they're talking about a positive flywheel for the whole real estate ecosystem by providing short-term space on one hand, immediate revenue to landlords on the other, and then foot traffic, which is going to be doing the work of basically boosting property values. So if you kind of read between the lines here, what Wallplay is being very clear about is instrumentalizing creative labor to basically generate value for landlords and for platforms. So this is a kind of technologized twist on the kind of creative class redevelopment strategy that we've heard for years from people like Richard Florida, and which has long used the arts to ultimately displace low-income communities of color. So I just want to kind of close here by acknowledging that a lot of these systems are in limbo right now because of the pandemic. But as the economic crisis drags on, it's clear that any potential recovery will reveal a very different urban world than the one extinguished in March. So at this point, I think it's even more important to be aware of the ways that capital uses digital platforms to consolidate control over the built environment, while small businesses and tenants are struggling to stay afloat. For example, even as austerity forces huge numbers of stores and restaurants to close, we're seeing large tech companies buying office space, private equity firms shopping for property, retail chains are using bankruptcy basically to get out of their lease obligations. So these are the kind of like political economic stakes of platform urbanism, which is really lurking behind the ball pits and the millennial and pink interiors of these kind of playgrounds and social media experiences. And these are the things that we're going to need to contest if we want to preserve the social fabric of the city as we used to know it. So thank you. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Leo. That was enlightening. So now we're going to turn back to Jenny. I believe the gremlins have been thoroughly removed from her microphone, and we're ready to go. So once again, Jenny Zhang, everyone.
Thanks, David. I'm assuming this is working now.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Sorry about that, everyone. Computers. So as David said, I'm Jenny. I'm a software engineer and writer. And today I want to talk about why the way we currently think about privacy isn't working and what we can do about it. So in 2018, the artist Dima Yarobinsky printed out the terms of services for a bunch of social media apps for an art exhibit, right? Light blue is Twitter, dark blue is Facebook, yellow is Snapchat, and pink is Instagram. And like, I don't know about you, but I know I've never read a single one of these. And I work in tech. I really should know better if my data gets used in ways I don't like. Theoretically, it's my fault for not being more careful before clicking I agree, which I hope we can all agree is silly, right? Because basically no one reads all of these. And yet terms of conditions are still the basic building blocks of online privacy. The GDPR and the CCPA, two of the most consumer-forward data privacy laws in effect, are both like, hey, we know how to deal with privacy. We'll make companies tell you what they want your data for, make them pinky swear they'll only use it for that one thing, and then if you ask them nicely, they have to delete what they know about you. And we'll do all of this with pop-ups. I mean, listen, the GDPR and the CCPA are still way better than what consumers had before, but they both use the notice and consent model, where I can consent or not to a company's terms, and that's kind of it. And this assumes that the main problem with privacy is that I didn't have enough say over who tracks me and how, which is the same individual and instrumental logic that gets us to like, what if you got to hide? And I'm not interesting enough to track anyway. Which, to be clear, isn't even what privacy means, right? Like, as one of my colleagues likes to say, we may have different ideas about keeping secrets, but all of us lock the door in public bathrooms. And this disconnect isn't the fault of the GDPR per se. Long before the internet, the right to privacy was closely related to laws against trespassing, so it was defined as the right to be left alone. Once we had electronic records, it was expanded to mean the right to control the flow of information about ourselves. And you can see how this made sense when privacy defined relationships between individuals or one person and one or two organizations. But in the internet era, this model of privacy as like a lever we pull to decide how much data we reveal just doesn't make sense anymore because there's way too many relationships to scale. It's not just what I tell you or what I tell the tax collector, it's what all of us tell every website and app we interact with and how all of them talk to each other behind our backs. And at a time when governments are increasingly investigating smart cities, which often involve a whole grid of millions of sensors, that scale is only going to keep growing. And so this means that our individual comfort about privacy is no longer the only part of the story, and we need to think about privacy as a public good and a collective value. So let's talk about what that is. The first reason we can't just think about privacy in individual terms is that our information is never just about us, right? Information is networked and contextual by nature, because the fact that I consider you a friend also tells people something about you. If I took a DNA test through 23andMe, which I wouldn't necessarily advise, that implicates the private medical information and potentially the health insurance coverage of not just my entire extended family, but all future relatives. I could email 23andMe and say, hey, like the GDPR says you have to forget everything I told about you, but how would everyone else affected by my decision know to do that? And so in other words, my decisions about my own data have negative externalities for the people around me. And in the age of COVID, this might sound pretty similar to another public good, public health. When I choose whether to wear a mask, that's partially about how much the mask protects me, but we're also trying to have a society here. So wearing a mask is also about protecting everyone else from me. If I say, hey, I'm responsible only for my own data and ignore the fact that I exist in a social context, that means that if I wanted to take some like dumb Facebook quiz in 2010, there's a pretty good chance you got infected with Cambridge Analytica. We're all only as private as our least private friend. And while there's individual things we can do to protect one another, it's all just a band-aid if there's no underlying infrastructure. It's not enough for each of us to wear masks if there's no contact tracing and no support for staying home. And it's not enough for me personally to be vigilant about my social graph if Clearview AI is just out there like vacuuming up anything we haven't explicitly hidden. And if we acknowledge that this isn't a problem we can solve as individuals, then the question stops being, what do I have to hide, but who is in my splash zone? So the second reason we need to think of privacy in individual terms is just the burden is too great for any individual to bear. Like, to start with, it's just not true that you're always free to make decisions about data, right? Like if your job uses Gmail, good luck telling them you conscientiously object to Google, and opting out of the banking and credit reporting systems is even harder. But even if we did have full control over these decisions, the amount of energy that would be required for all of us to monitor everyone we've ever given any data to forever is just too much, especially when those privacy relationships are constantly changing, because companies change and we change and the world changes. So here's an example. Have I Been Pwned is a wonderful service that everyone should sign up for immediately because it notifies you if your email was part of a data breach. I've personally been part of 15. And one of them is a service that I signed up for when I was 11, Neopets. There is nothing you could have said to convince that 11-year-old not to sign up for Neopets, and there's also nothing I can do today as a paranoid tech professional to change the outcome of that decision. And like the worst thing you could do on Neopets is just be mean to my pet. What about LiveJournal? Imagine a queer kid who joined LiveJournal in 2002 looking for community. And then in 2007, LiveJournal is sold to a company based in Russia, which in 2013 criminalized the distribution of pro-LGBTQ content to minors. And then in 2017, LiveJournal lost the account information of 26 million users. Was it that kid's responsibility to monitor the shifting geopolitical context of their childhood diary for the next 25 years, just in case they suddenly ran afoul of another country's changing laws? Like, that's absurd. And the absurdity of this individual burden often reminds me of recycling. Because yes, there's absolutely digital safety measures we can take, like password managers and two-factor authentication and so on, but they don't address the core issue of scale. And we can and should recycle, but it doesn't change the fact that 71% of global emissions are caused by 100 companies. And it certainly doesn't change the fact that those companies have spent decades lying to us about how effective recycling is so they can keep churning out plastic. These are structural problems that we can't recycle our way out of, just as we can't notice and consent our way into collective privacy. The third reason that the individual frame isn't just good enough anymore is that when data goes wrong, it goes wrong on a catastrophic scale. Like, recycling might not work as well as we'd like, but at least it's something we can do as individuals. There's nothing you and I could have done to prevent BP from spilling millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And there's nothing you and I can really do to prevent our data from being stolen. And I think there's often not a good enough understanding of just how impossible it is to guarantee data security. The only truly secure data is data you never collected in the first place. And this isn't just like a matter of changing industry norms or making programmers be less lazy, though speaking as a lazy programmer, there's definitely a lot of us out there. This is just the nature of systems, right? Because systems are cheaper to attack than they are to defend. If you want to defend a system, you have to make sure every part of it is perfectly implemented. But if you want to attack, all you have to do is find one weakness. The more complex a system is, the harder it becomes to find all the places where potential weaknesses are. And even if you find a weakness and you add a defense that fixes it, you've also just made it more complex. And the thing that makes computers particularly vulnerable to this is that often when there's a weakness in a digital system, that system has been deployed to millions of devices in our phones and laptops and watches and refrigerators and doorbells. And this is known as a class break, because an entire class of devices can break instantly, but we still have to go fix them one by one. And this is how the Equifax data leak happened. Equifax used a piece of open source software that had a security flaw in it. The people who make that software found it and fixed it. And then instead of updating their system right away, Equifax said, remind me tomorrow for 4 months, and let hackers steal hundreds of millions of customer records. And while Equifax is definitely liable for bad security practices, That story also shows how fragile our computer systems can be, because from the moment this bug was discovered, every server that ran that software became a ticking time bomb. This is why security researcher Bruce Schneier calls data a toxic asset, and software engineer and activist Maciej Jaglowski compares data to nuclear waste. Because while the promise of nuclear energy is great, we've never quite figured out what to do with nuclear waste, which by definition will outlive all the institutions that generated it. And often what we do is we shrug, stick it underground in a big vat, and put up some scary warning signs. And similarly, because data storage is so cheap, for decades the tech industry has been like, we might as well keep all of it until we figure out how to make even more money from it. Which means there's just like petabytes of toxic data on hard drives all around the world waiting to go off in these impossible to defend systems whose economic incentive structures encourage neglect. Unlike nuclear waste, we could literally just delete this data. But we're not going to get there by each of us individually emailing services to be like, excuse me, can you delete my data? And finally, the thing that I personally think is the most important reason to stop thinking about privacy individually and shift to a collective mindset is just that society is better when everyone has a basic right to privacy. Like, privacy is essential to human agency and dignity. We tell parents to respect their kids' privacy because we recognize that it's a vital component of healthy development. And we've all seen what happens to celebrities who live their entire lives under a microscope. But if we don't enshrine privacy as a collective value on a societal level, we're basically saying, you know what, actually, it's fine that we can't protect the private sphere, the public one is good enough. And that would be deeply damaging, not just for our individual agency or even our ability to prevent government overreach, but for our fundamental capacity to be a democracy. We have to be able to distinguish who we are as individuals from the norms and pressures of the group in order to think about how we can assert power to shape that group. And elections have secret ballots for a reason. If we do care about privacy as a collective value, then it cannot be an individual burden. Because if you only have a right when you're hyper-vigilant about defending it, you don't really have that right. And right now, privacy is essentially a luxury good. If you can afford not to use coupons, you don't have to let retailers track your shopping habits with loyalty points. If you're technically savvy, you don't have to let Gmail see all of your emails. But not only does that make access to privacy incredibly inequitable, it creates a system in which my privacy decisions can erode your rights. If everyone else uses insecure texting apps and you use Signal, then having Signal on your phone becomes a red flag for law enforcement because everyone else doesn't care. What have you got to hide? And if you use Signal because you're an activist or you belong to a marginalized group that's targeted by the state, you are doubly harmed by this. So instead of asking, why don't you want Google to see your email? We should be asking, why does Google deserve to see your email? And most importantly, we need to learn to ask, if we as a society value the notion of private communications, how can we best design email systems to achieve that? So what's next? I would love to be like, here's one weird trick to save privacy, but unfortunately, it is not that easy. The good news is we've been studying how to protect public goods for a while. Like, we know the way to make people care about negative externalities is to make them pay for it. That's why carbon pricing is one of the most efficient ways of reducing emissions. So we could consider, for example, a data tax. But there's also a cautionary tale in pricing externalities because you have to have the will to enforce it. Western Canada right now is littered with tens of thousands of orphan wells that oil production companies just haven't bothered to clean up. It didn't matter that they signed contracts saying they would if we're not going to go after them for it. And now the Canadian government is chipping in $1.7 billion to do it for them. And similarly, when we build principles for data governance, we need to ensure we're also building in enforcement mechanisms and following through. Otherwise, it's little more than ethics washing. We also know that while public goods often have a free rider problem, people are actually pretty willing to act for the collective good if they know that others will too. There's many examples throughout history of communities banding together to collectively govern a shared resource like forestry or grazing grounds. And as data governance researcher Anouk Ruhak points out, that idea can also be used in collective data governance using things like data trusts or data commons. And a data commons might look something like Driver's Seat, which is a worker-owned co-op of gig economy drivers who collect their own driving data to get insights that normally Uber or Lyft would keep secrets. And they then can decide what to do with that data, like share it with cities and use that to share profits with drivers. And third, collective action isn't just for the consumers. Anyone who works with data can influence the future of privacy by organizing. Our tech overlords are pretty powerful, but they still rely on the labor of their employees. And if you work in tech, organizing with your colleagues is one of the most powerful things you can do to influence policy and product direction. There's a reason Amazon is hiring private investigators to bust organizing. It threatens them. And finally, I want to talk about the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It was published in 1962, and it documented the widespread harms caused by synthetic pesticides. It had a seismic impact on the environmental movement. It led to a nationwide ban on the use of DDT for agriculture, and eventually, what this book did and why it was so influential is that it shifted the narrative about pesticides away from the individual frame of, can this thing help a farmer with their crops, to a collective biotic analysis. Though criticisms of DDT didn't start with Rachel Carson, the public needed to understand the network effects of cumulative exposure in the food chain, the scale of splash damage on the ecosystem, and their impact for future generations of farmers who would inherit the ecosystem before we were willing to take it seriously as a collective problem. Now, I don't think data is like DDT, though it's not like DDT, because I also want us to think about the network effects of inherently contextual information and the scale of privacy relationships that no individual can be expected to manage on their own, and the need to design our governance systems to be resilient to future generations so that we recognize this for the collective problem that it is. And above all, I want to emphasize the power that shifting our frame of focus can have in expanding our vision of what's possible. Right now, we're still thinking in incremental terms about the individual privacy relationships between you and the companies that want your data. But if we think of privacy as a public good, the scope of solutions we can let ourselves imagine becomes so much bigger, right? Like, it still feels ludicrous to say something like ban inferred data and ban cross-reference data, or ban behavioral data, ban selling data. But banning DDT also seemed ludicrous until it wasn't. These are all policy choices, and we don't have to take anything as a foregone conclusion. So I would love for us to take the question of data governance out of the narrow technocratic sphere it's currently in and see it for what it really is: a fight for a public good and our collective rights, and ultimately a nicer world to live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Why don't you stick around, and Leo, why don't you join us? And let's have a discussion, because I think the Venn diagram where you two meet is really fascinating. But before we actually get to that, Jenny, all the metaphors that you put together, I think, were really enlightening, and it reminds me of yet another one, which is after the Brighton hotel bombing, in trying to assassinate Margaret Thatcher, the IRA said, you have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky once, right? And I think that's so the power reversal is almost is there, I think, with data, in that we have to be lucky all the time for our information to not get out, and the hacker only has to be lucky once, right? So it's another one of those times where the whole system needs to be rethought. But I do think that and tell me what you think about this, that sort of mirrors I think this connection between technocracy, like you were describing, this technical approach, and also liberal democracy, right? These sort of liberal individualistic approaches to problem solving in the realm of politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely a component of the question of how we protect our individual data that's very rooted in a specific, like, Western ideal of individualism. And I think it's really interesting the way we often talk about data protection in sort of victim blaming terms, right? Like, if you got hacked, you should have used a password manager, you should have done this and done that. But, like, I've used a password manager my entire adult life, and there's still insecure passwords in there, right? There's just too much to deal with. And it's almost like a weird perversion of the just world hypothesis of, if bad things only happen to bad people. If I'm just perfect in all of my behavior, then the bad thing won't ever happen to me. But that's, I mean, as we know, first of all, that's not how anything works, really. But a system where we say if people just behave perfectly, then like everything will be solved, that is not a workable system, and that is not how we want to go about building a society.
I think that's yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. Yeah, and Leo, I actually just I want to bring out a fairly straightforward question first before we go deeper into the guts of your presentation, which is just what attracts people to Instagram playgrounds? Why do they exist? Why do people go to these?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really good question, because a lot of us are sitting there looking at images of them or walking by lines of people waiting for hours in the street to pay $25 to go into these and wondering the same question. There was a great piece by the writer Amanda Hess that came out last year, in which she basically talked about how the whole thing is basically just waiting, and the experience that you're supposed to have, this experiential, that, you know, it's the basis of the experiential space, is actually just horrible. And I think that kind of points to the reality that you're really using it as a tool for something else, that there is this kind of identity claiming or verification process that you're kind of using the space as an instrument to accomplish. But the other thing that I would also say is that even if we think that we're above a certain kind of obvious Instagram playground, we're really not, because you know, if we're looking for restaurants through Google, or if we're looking for recommendations through people that we know in our kind of social media networks, we're basically doing the same thing, just on a kind of softer level. So, you know, like we might go to a bar or a restaurant or something, and we might like the aesthetic, and we might kind of, you know what I mean, even if we're not kind of posting actively or following this kind of like a more obvious form of gamified or like kind of play design, we're kind of part of it. And I think that's sort of a little bit similar to what Jenny was saying in her talk about just kind of participation and consent.
Yeah, and you know, if I could actually take some of Jenny's takeaways and apply it to yours, Leo, for a moment, is that you know, if you laid out all of these horrifying externalities, right, of what sort of this experience economy could bring about, where entire blocks can just be sort of turned into these like hourly rented playground things, right? And as an individual, if I don't like that, right, I don't really have any ability to change it, right? Because like there's nothing in my personal purchasing habits that could push back against that, except for me, you know, because it really doesn't seem like, you know, spending $25 to stand in line to take a picture in a tub full of balls or something, like doesn't, you know, like, you know, that's gonna be the least of Instagram's worries, right? So maybe this is really for the both of you, you know, in these moments where the individual can't, like, you know, vote with their pocketbook or something like that, right? You know, where in the middle, I guess, in both of your presentations, do you see collective action working at its best against these forces that you're describing? Jenny, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a really interesting example and like manifestation of this lack of individual power with the series of steps and landings in Hudson Yard, right? Like the vessel, because they tried to say we have the rights over all of your social media pictures. We can use them for whatever we want at any time we want forever. And there was outcry, and they've toned that down a little bit, but it's still kind of the same principle of we get to dictate how you interact with our space, and you just have to take it, and that's it. And I don't think the solution is going to be like, just don't spend money there, or don't take photos, or any of those things. Like, I think self-expression is important. I think public art is important, and I don't think we should be limiting those features. And I think the question we need to be asking is like the regulatory and legal framework around something like Hudson Yard or, vessel, like why would we allow those kinds of terms to be admissible or enforceable? Why would we say like a private company has the ability to just tell individuals, anybody who walks onto our premises relinquishes all of these rights? Like those are things that we need to be looking at a municipal regulatory level, rather than expecting individual consumers to try and change it. And so I think like the answer in a lot of cases is get involved with local politics.
Leo, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I really appreciated the extent to which Jenny emphasized organizing in her talk, because I think it's totally the exact same situation here. I mean, on the real estate side, at least, like a lot of these things are popping up because there isn't adequate rent control, because there's not adequate protections for commercial leaseholders. Like small business tenants have been disappearing for years. It's a kind of a common problem. So we're allowing these kind of systems to link up, which we should really be preventing through regulation, through policymaking, through protest. And I'm glad that we're seeing a lot more of it now, with calls to cancel rent and put in place an actual justice agenda when it comes to urbanism. I'm also really glad that Jenny mentioned sidewalk labs in her talk, because I think it's also like another great point of convergence between like this placemaking strategy and also this kind of like hoovering up of personal data and the inability of people to opt out of it. And we know that sidewalk labs was kind of, they pulled the plug on their Toronto development in part because of some activism that was really laser focused on things like public procurement and how government purchases technology platforms and how government issues permits to development. And so I think that's a really interesting model of like really, really zeroing in on how public entities deal with private actors in all of these kind of regulatory realms. It's not as sexy, but it is really essential.
Yeah, speaking of sexy, like a normal person, I have some of the vessel's terms of service up right here, some quotes. And, part of it says, like photos, audio recording, or video footage depicting or related to the vessel, quote, they own all of that, quote, any purpose whatsoever in any and all media in either case, known or unknown to the developed later. Or develop later, right? So, and then that they changed that just slightly to the management company has quote the right to repost, share, publish, promote, and distribute the vessel media via such social media channel and via websites associated with the vessel or Hudson Yards in perpetuity, right? So it's not, like they caved, but I mean, like, they went from 11 to 10 and a half, right? So it's that's of course on the corporate evilness scale. So like what? So I guess what I want to ask both of you is, what are a lot of normal people, would say like, so what? I think Jenny got at this to some degree, right? Like, what do you have to hide, right? What do we say to people that gets them? Because it seems like all three of us agree that people have to get involved in this. So like, what do we start saying to people to reframe the debate from you have nothing to hide to well, we have everything to gain together? Either one of you, however the feeling grabs you.
I feel like you've just answered your own question in that we frame it away from the potential loss, which many people think of as being minimal, to the potential gain. I think one of the things that Hudson's Yard backed off of is they're now saying, like, if you take a photo of the vessel from the streets, which is public area, public property, that no longer is covered by those draconian terms. And it's like, those are the things that I find most salient in considering these things, because do public art installations get public funds? A lot of them do. If you get taxpayer funding for this, why should you get to dictate this, right? And I think like framing it in terms of not just what do we have to gain, but like what kind of world we want to live in. because we can't just tell people like this is bad and you should run away from it. We have to tell people what they're running to, right? And I think like it really behooves us to paint a picture of how nice the alternative could be if, you know, public art were just a thing that we could all share without worrying about signing away our firstborn or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think in New York, at least right now, there's a lot of really great examples of this case being made persuasively, whether it's about you know, like defunding the New York City Police Department and redirecting funds into programs that actually sustain people's lives, or whether it's about, you know, taxing the rich in order to fund housing and other, you know, critical social resources. I think there is a lot of great rhetorical work being done to actually envision the way that we want to use resources and the way that we want to organize space and regulation. Yeah, I don't know how much more I have to add. I'm glad I heard Jenny's talk because I hadn't really considered like the approaches to data governance very much. I mean, I've followed a little bit of what's been going on with some of the congressional hearings on the tech companies, but I feel like the case has been made to me effectively.
Great. So to round out the this conversation, you know, I was wondering if both of you could tell me where value comes from in your respective papers, right? Because in both of these, what I'm seeing is that, you know, obviously companies are licking their chops, finding something, you know, a brand new place to extract value, and wherever there's value, there's human labor. So like where is this coming from whether it's you know these Instagram parks or from the ambient data that keeps sloughing off our bodies as we go about our day? Where does value come from? Leo, why don't you give it a shot?
Sure. Yeah, I think in cities at least there's multiple locations, and a lot of what kind of platform businesses are doing are trying to triangulate in order to capture the flow or the creation of value at those different sites. So like property is something that holds value, obviously. But as we've seen, like it can kind of get jammed up or unlocked in certain ways. And it can be linked to other forms of value through labor that people are performing. So, I mean, you can consider the fact that you're posting from a certain place about a certain brand or space or whatever as a kind of form of labor that is only made possible through the linkages that a certain platform has created. And then obviously the data that is produced as a byproduct of that initial cycle has its own kind of value as a set of information for making future predictions and bets about kind of what is going to happen in urban space. So yeah, I think it's a really tricky question that has to be kind of attended to in very specific ways because there are these very specific links.
Yeah, I agree that it's definitely a tricky question. I think some of the like difficulties we've had with how to figure out like data metaphors of like, is data the new oil? Is data the new whatever kind of demonstrates that it's a difficult question to untangle. To me, the like notion of data and information is just data is an attempt to represent reality. And the thing that we're trying to quantify when we pull in all of these is really the individual human relationships, right? And I think we lose something when we think about value as being generated by these, instrumental is the best word for it, but these sort of like very mechanistic notions of, you know, my data set has 50 megabytes in it, and that is X amount of value. But what we're not seeing is what that data set represents in terms of my social graph and my experiences and those sorts of things. And I'm not really sure how that can be quantified, or quite frankly, whether it should, right? Like there's an argument to be made that we shouldn't be trying to turn the human experience into this like flattened, extractable, numerical thing. And so I think the same as with individual relationships and data, and honestly, same as with cities, like these are very organic, emergent properties, and we should just embrace as complex and nuanced as we can be.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you, Jenny and Leo, for your brilliant presentations. This has been another episode of Theorizing the Web Presents. Thank you all for joining us so much. Remember that we're taking a break because I've heard there might be an election coming up. So, we're taking about a 3-week break. We'll see you on the other side, whatever that looks like. And so once again, from everyone at Theorizing the Web, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great week.